My parents spent my entire childhood telling me I was an embarrassment to the family. They made me wear oversized clothes, cut my own hair, and basically told me to stay invisible whenever we went anywhere public. They said I'd never amount to anything and that people would just stare at me for all the wrong reasons. But last Tuesday, everything changed when Mayor Patricia Coleman personally called our house and asked if she could take professional photos with me for the city's annual campaign. My parents went from hiding me away to suddenly wanting to be front and center in every single picture. Here's how a girl they called their biggest mistake became the person the whole town wanted to celebrate. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up as Vanessa Mitchell in Riverside Falls, Ohio, I learned pretty early that my parents saw me as their personal disappointment. Not because I was getting into trouble or failing school. Actually, I was pulling straight A's and had never even gotten detention. The problem, according to them, was much simpler. I looked different, and they couldn't handle it. I was born with a condition called heterochromia, which means my eyes are two completely different colors. My left eye is bright green, almost emerald, and my right eye is deep brown. Most people think it's pretty cool when they first notice, but my parents, Richard and Susan Mitchell, saw it as some kind of genetic defect that reflected poorly on them. "Why can't you just wear those colored contacts like normal kids?" my mom would say every morning as I got ready for school. "People are going to stare, Vanessa. Do you really want to draw that kind of attention to our family?" My dad was even worse. He'd make comments like, "Great, now everyone's going to think there's something wrong with the Mitchell gene pool," or "Maybe if you just keep your head down, people won't notice as much." By the time I turned 14, they had me convinced that I was basically a walking embarrassment. They bought me clothes that were always 2 sizes too big, claiming it would help me blend in better. They refused to take me to a proper hair salon, insisting I could just trim my own hair at home to save money, though I knew they made plenty of money from Dad's accounting firm and Mom's real estate business. The worst part was how they acted during any kind of public event. School plays, award ceremonies, even just grocery shopping. They'd position themselves so I was always slightly behind them, like they were trying to create some distance. If someone did notice my eyes and made a positive comment, my parents would give these forced, uncomfortable smiles and quickly change the subject. "Oh, that's just Vanessa," my mom would say with this tight laugh. "She's always been our little oddball." I started believing them. I genuinely thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unfit for normal social situations. I'd practiced walking with my head down, taught myself to avoid direct eye contact, and even developed this habit of partially covering my face with my hair whenever I talked to people. High school wasn't much better. My parents made sure I understood that participating in any kind of extracurricular activities was out of the question. "Why draw unnecessary attention?" they'd say. So while other kids were joining drama clubs, playing sports, or running for student government, I spent most of my time in the library or walking home alone. The few friends I did manage to make were usually other quiet kids who didn't ask too many questions about why I never invited them over or why my parents never showed up to school events. I became really good at making excuses and deflecting conversations about family stuff. But here's the thing. Even though I was shy and self-conscious about my appearance, I was genuinely smart, like really smart. I had this natural ability to absorb information and solve complex problems that even impressed my teachers. Math, science, literature, history, it all just made sense to me in a way it didn't seem to for most other students. My junior year English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was the first adult who really seemed to notice me as more than just a quiet kid in the back row. She started giving me extra reading assignments and would ask me to help tutor other students who were struggling. For the first time in my life, I felt like maybe I had something valuable to offer. "Vanessa, you have a gift," she told me one afternoon after class. "Your analytical writing is at a college level, and the way you explain complex concepts to other students is remarkable. Have you thought about applying for any academic scholarships?" The idea had never even occurred to me. My parents had always made it clear that I'd probably end up at the local community college, if anywhere at all. They'd never talked about universities or scholarships or any kind of future that involved me standing out in a positive way. But Mrs. Rodriguez planted a seed that started growing despite my parents' best efforts to keep me small. She helped me research different scholarship opportunities and even stayed after school to help me work on application essays. She never made a big deal about my eyes, never treated me like I was fragile or different. She just saw my potential and wanted to help me develop it. By senior year, I had quietly applied to 17 different colleges and scholarship programs. I didn't tell my parents because I knew they'd find some way to discourage me or make me feel like I was reaching too high. Instead, I had all the correspondence sent to Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom, and she'd pass along any important information during our after-school meetings. The first acceptance letter came in March, then another. By April, I had been accepted to 14 schools, with full academic scholarships to 8 of them. The University of Chicago offered me their most prestigious merit scholarship, covering not just tuition, but also housing, meals, and even a stipend for books and supplies. I was terrified to tell my parents, but I knew I couldn't hide it forever. I chose a Thursday evening when they were both home and relatively relaxed, thinking maybe they'd surprise me with some enthusiasm or pride. I was wrong. "The University of Chicago?" my dad said, looking at the scholarship letter like it was written in a foreign language. "Vanessa, that's completely unrealistic. Do you know how competitive those schools are? How many normal, confident kids are going to be there?" My mom was even more direct. "Honey, you can barely make eye contact with the cashier at the grocery store. How do you think you're going to handle living in a big city with thousands of other students? You'll be miserable, and honestly, you'll probably embarrass yourself." They spent the next 2 hours explaining all the reasons why accepting the scholarship would be a mistake. I was too shy, too awkward, too different. I'd never fit in with the other students. I'd probably fail my classes because the pressure would be too much. I should just go to Riverside Community College, like they'd always planned, maybe get a basic degree in something practical, and find a quiet job where I wouldn't have to interact with too many people. "We're just trying to protect you," my mom said, using that same tone she'd used my whole life, when she was really just trying to protect herself from having a daughter who might draw attention. "We know you better than anyone, and we know your limitations." But for the first time in 18 years, I didn't believe them. Mrs. Rodriguez had shown me test scores, writing samples, and recommendation letters that proved I wasn't the limitation they'd convinced me I was. I had teachers from multiple subjects writing things like exceptional analytical abilities and demonstrates leadership potential and one of the most insightful students I've taught in 20 years. The next morning, I walked into Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom and told her I wanted to accept the University of Chicago scholarship. "I'm proud of you, Vanessa," she said, and it was the first time in my life an adult had said those words to me. "This is going to change everything for you." She was right, but not in the way either of us expected. That summer, while I was preparing to leave for college, something started happening in Riverside Falls that nobody saw coming. The city had been selected as a pilot location for a new nationwide initiative focused on celebrating and supporting students with unique perspectives and diverse backgrounds. The program was designed to highlight young people who had overcome challenges or who brought different viewpoints to their communities. Apparently, Mrs. Rodriguez had nominated me for the program back in the spring, along with a detailed essay about my academic achievements and my potential to represent the kind of student the initiative wanted to celebrate. She never told me she was doing it because she knew I'd probably talk myself out of it or let my parents convince me I wasn't qualified. The first I heard about it was when Mayor Patricia Coleman called our house on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. I happened to answer the phone because my parents were both at work. "Is this Vanessa Mitchell?" she asked in this warm, professional voice. "This is Mayor Coleman from the city office. I have some wonderful news to share with you." I almost hung up because I thought it was some kind of sales call or maybe someone playing a prank. But she kept talking, explaining about the pilot program and how I'd been selected as Riverside Falls representative student. She wanted to schedule a professional photo session for the city's promotional materials, and there would also be a community celebration event where I'd be recognized alongside similar students from other participating cities. The photography session would be this Saturday if you're available. We're really excited to showcase your academic achievements and your plans for the University of Chicago. It's exactly the kind of success story we want to highlight. I was so stunned I could barely respond. Nobody had ever wanted to showcase me for anything, let alone my academic achievements. I managed to stammer out that I'd need to check with my parents, and Mayor Coleman said she'd be happy to call back later to speak with them directly. When my parents got home that evening, I tried to explain what had happened, but they initially didn't believe me. My dad actually laughed and said, "Vanessa, nobody's calling you for photo sessions. You probably misunderstood what they wanted." But then Mayor Coleman called back, just like she said she would, and my parents had to take the conversation seriously. I watched their faces change as she explained the program, the selection process, and how the photos would be used in materials that would be distributed statewide and potentially nationally. "So this is legitimate?" my mom asked, her voice getting higher and tighter. "Like official city business?" Mayor Coleman replied, and I could hear her voice through the phone from across the room. "Vanessa's academic record is truly exceptional, and her teachers speak very highly of her character and potential. We're honored to have her represent our community." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. After they hung up, my parents just stared at each other for a long moment. Then they looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time in 18 years. "Well," my dad said slowly, "I suppose we should probably get you some nicer clothes for the photo session." The next 3 days were completely surreal. My parents, who had spent 18 years trying to make me invisible, suddenly became obsessed with making sure I looked presentable for the mayor's photo session. My mom took the day off work Friday to take me shopping, which was literally the first time in my life she'd ever done that. We drove to Eastwood Mall, which was about an hour away and way fancier than anywhere we'd ever shopped together. She marched me straight into Nordstrom like she'd been planning this for months. "We need something professional but approachable," she told the sales associate, using phrases I'd never heard her say before. "Something that photographs well. This is for official city materials." The sales associate, a woman named Jennifer, was incredibly nice and seemed genuinely excited to help. She pulled out several outfits and explained how different colors and styles would work with professional lighting. When she complimented my eyes and said they'd be striking in photographs, my mom actually agreed with her instead of changing the subject. "Yes, they're quite unique," my mom said, like this was something she'd always been proud of. "Very photogenic." I almost choked. This was the same woman who had been trying to get me to wear colored contacts for years. We ended up with a navy blue blazer, a crisp white blouse, and dark gray slacks that actually fit me properly. My mom also insisted on buying me new shoes, a leather portfolio, and even some light makeup. The total came to over $400, which was more than my parents had ever spent on clothes for me in a single year, let alone a single shopping trip. That evening, my dad came home with business cards, not for himself, for me. "I thought you might need these," he said, handing me a box of professionally printed cards that read, "Vanessa Mitchell, University of Chicago Scholar," with my phone number and email address. "You never know who you might meet at this photo session." I stared at the cards in complete disbelief. 6 months ago, these same people were telling me I'd probably fail at community college. Now they were printing business cards for me like I was some kind of important professional. Saturday morning arrived, and my parents were more nervous than I'd ever seen them. My mom spent an hour doing my hair and makeup, constantly stepping back to evaluate her work like she was preparing me for a magazine cover. My dad kept checking the time and reminding us that we couldn't be late for something this important. The photo session was scheduled at City Hall, which was this beautiful old building with marble columns and huge windows that let in amazing natural light. When we walked in, Mayor Coleman was waiting with a professional photographer named Marcus Rivera and two people from the state education department. Vanessa, Mayor Coleman said, walking over with this huge, genuine smile. I'm so excited to finally meet you in person. Mrs. Rodriguez has told me such wonderful things about your academic journey. She shook my hand like I was an adult, not some awkward teenager, and introduced me to everyone like I was the guest of honor. The photographer immediately started talking about how my eyes were going to be incredible in the photos, and one of the state representatives mentioned that my scholarship story was exactly what they hoped to feature in their statewide campaign. My parents were practically glowing. They positioned themselves nearby, clearly hoping to be included in some of the shots, and kept interjecting comments about how proud they were and how they'd always known I was special. The actual photo session lasted about 2 hours. Marcus, the photographer, was incredibly professional and made me feel completely comfortable. He explained what he was doing with the lighting and camera angles, asked me questions about my plans for college, and genuinely seemed interested in my story. Tell me about the moment you decided to pursue the University of Chicago, he said while adjusting his camera settings. I started talking about Mrs. Rodriguez and how she'd helped me see possibilities I'd never considered before. I explained how terrifying but exciting it felt to think about studying in a completely different environment, surrounded by people who were just as passionate about learning as I was. That's beautiful, Marcus said, taking several shots while I was talking. Your face completely lights up when you talk about your future. These are going to be incredible photos. Mayor Coleman joined us for several shots, and she was so warm and encouraging throughout the entire process. She asked thoughtful questions about my academic interests, my plans for choosing a major, and how I hoped to use her education to eventually contribute back to the community.
Students like Vanessa represent the absolute best of what we're trying to achieve in our educational system, she said during one of the interview portions. Her academic excellence, combined with her resilience and character, makes her exactly the kind of young person we want to celebrate and support. The weirdest part was watching my parents' reaction to all of this. They kept exchanging these looks like they couldn't believe what was happening. When Mayor Coleman mentioned that the photos would likely be used in state-level promotional materials and possibly picked up by education publications, my dad actually pulled out his phone to start taking pictures of me being photographed. After the official session ended, Mayor Coleman asked if we'd like to stay for a brief tour of City Hall, including her office and the council chambers. My parents immediately said yes, and we spent another hour walking through the building while she explained local government processes and encouraged me to stay involved in civic activities even while I was away at college. We're going to miss having such a bright young woman in our community, she said as we wrapped up the tour, but I have a feeling you're going to do amazing things at University of Chicago, and we'll all be following your success. She gave me her business card and told me to stay in touch, especially if I ever needed any kind of reference or recommendation for future opportunities. She also mentioned that there would be a community celebration event in about 3 weeks where I'd be formally recognized, and that several local news outlets had expressed interest in covering the story. On the drive home, my parents were practically buzzing with excitement. They kept talking about how professional everything had been, how impressed Mayor Coleman seemed with me, and how significant this whole opportunity was for our family. I think we should frame some of these photos when we get them back, my mom said. Maybe put together a nice display in the living room. This was the same living room where there had never been a single photo of me displayed anywhere. Every wall was covered with pictures of my parents' achievements, their wedding, family members, and even our dog, but nothing featuring me. Now she wanted to create a whole display. We should probably call Aunt Margaret and let her know about this, my dad added. She's going to be so impressed. Her daughter never got recognized by the mayor for anything. I sat in the back seat listening to them plan how to share this news with relatives and family friends, people who had barely heard them mention me in positive terms before. It was like they were suddenly discovering they had a daughter worth bragging about. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez called to check how everything went. I told her about the photo session, the tour, and how surreal it felt to have my parents treating me like some kind of accomplished person instead of an embarrassment. Vanessa, you've always been accomplished, she said gently. The only thing that's changed is that now other people are recognizing what was always there. Your parents are just catching up to what those of us who really know you have seen all along. She was probably right, but it still felt weird to have 18 years of messaging suddenly reversed overnight. Part of me was happy that my parents were finally proud of me, but another part was frustrated that it took external validation from the mayor and a photographer to make them see my worth. The photos came back the following Wednesday, and they were absolutely stunning. Marcus had captured something in my expression that I'd never seen before: confidence, intelligence, genuine happiness. In every single shot, my heterochromia looked striking and beautiful, instead of like something to hide. My mom immediately took several prints to get them professionally framed, and my dad started showing them to colleagues at his accounting firm. They both changed their social media profile pictures to photos of the three of us from the session, and my mom even created a whole album titled Our Scholar Daughter. But the real surprise came 2 days later, when Mayor Coleman called again. "Vanessa, I hope you don't mind another call," Mayor Coleman said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. "But I have some news that I think you're going to find very interesting." Apparently, the state education department had been so impressed with my photos and story that they decided to feature me as the primary face of their entire campaign. Not just for Ohio, but for a multi-state initiative that would include billboards, website headers, and promotional materials distributed to high schools across the Midwest. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, still trying to process what she was telling me. "Well, it means your photo is going to be seen by potentially millions of people," she explained. "The campaign launches in September, right around the time you start college, and it's designed to encourage other students to pursue academic excellence regardless of their background or circumstances." She went on to explain that there would be additional photo sessions, possibly some video interviews, and that I'd be invited to speak at several education conferences throughout the fall. The state was also offering a small stipend for my participation, which would help cover additional college expenses.
"I want to make sure you're comfortable with this level of exposure," Mayor Coleman said. "It's a wonderful opportunity, but I understand it's also a big step up from what we originally discussed." When I hung up the phone, my parents were standing in the kitchen doorway, clearly having overheard the entire conversation. My mom's eyes were practically shining with tears, and my dad looked like he'd just won the lottery. "Billboards?" my mom whispered. "Our daughter's going to be on billboards?" The next few weeks were a complete whirlwind. The state education team sent a coordinator named Sarah Chin to work with our family on scheduling and logistics. She was this incredibly organized woman who treated me like a legitimate spokesperson, not just a lucky teenager who'd stumbled into an opportunity. "Vanessa, you have a really compelling story," Sarah told me during our first meeting. "A lot of students face challenges that make them feel different or excluded, but you've turned that into academic success and personal growth. That's exactly the message we want to share." She explained that the campaign would focus on 3 main themes: academic excellence despite obstacles, the importance of supportive educators like Mrs. Rodriguez, and the value of pursuing opportunities even when they seem intimidating. They wanted to use my heterochromia as a visual symbol of how differences can actually be strengths instead of limitations. My parents went into full stage parent mode. My mom bought herself new outfits for any events where she might be photographed with me. My dad started researching media training and public relations strategies like he was preparing to manage my career. They both began dropping casual mentions of our daughter's campaign into conversations with neighbors, coworkers, and basically anyone who would listen. The second photo shoot was even more elaborate than the first. This time we drove to Columbus, where they had a full professional studio with multiple lighting setups and wardrobe options. The photographer, a woman named Ashley Park, specialized in education campaigns and knew exactly how to capture the kind of images they needed. "Your eyes are absolutely perfect for this," she told me while adjusting the camera angles. "They're going to draw people in and make them want to read your story. But more importantly, you have this genuine authenticity that comes through in every shot." They photographed me in different outfits and settings, sitting at a desk with books and laptops, standing in front of a chalkboard with equations, walking across what looked like a college campus. Each setup was designed to represent different aspects of academic achievement and future potential. The most surreal part was when they brought in my parents for some family shots. Suddenly, my mom was positioning herself to make sure her face was visible in every frame, and my dad kept trying to catch the photographer's attention with comments about how proud they were and how they'd always supported my education. Ashley was professional enough not to comment on their behavior, but I caught her giving me a few knowing looks when my parents were being particularly obvious about trying to insert themselves into the spotlight. The interview portion was actually my favorite part. They had me talk to a videographer named Marcus Thompson about my academic journey, my experience with feeling different, and my hopes for college. Unlike the awkward conversations I usually had with adults, this felt natural and engaging. What would you say to other students who feel like their differences make them less likely to succeed? Marcus asked. I think the things that make you feel different are often the same things that give you unique perspectives and strengths, I answered. I spent so many years trying to hide my eyes because I thought they made me weird, but now I realize they're part of what makes me memorable and distinctive. Your differences aren't flaws to overcome, they're advantages to embrace. As I said it, I realized I actually believed it, not just as something positive to say for the camera, but as something I genuinely learned about myself over the past few months. The campaign launched 3 weeks before I left for college, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The first billboard went up on Interstate 71, just outside of Columbus, featuring a close-up of my face with the text, "Excellence has no limits," and information about the scholarship programs. My mom drove 40 minutes just to take a picture of herself standing in front of the billboard. She posted it on every social media platform she had, with captions like, "So proud of our amazing daughter," and "Dreams really do come true." The website launched the same day, and by evening it had already received thousands of visits. The main page featured a slideshow of my photos, along with quotes from my interview about overcoming challenges and pursuing academic goals despite obstacles. But the real validation came from the messages that started pouring in. Students from all over the Midwest began reaching out through the campaign website, sharing their own stories about feeling different or excluded. Teachers contacted me to say they were using my story to motivate students who were struggling with confidence or family pressure. Mrs. Rodriguez forwarded me dozens of emails from other educators who wanted to replicate the kind of support and encouragement she'd provided. Several universities reached out to learn more about my academic background, and a few scholarship organizations offered additional funding opportunities.
This is exactly what we hoped would happen, Sarah Chen told me during a follow-up call. Your story is resonating with people in a way that's creating real positive impact. We're already seeing increased applications for academic scholarships and more students reaching out to guidance counselors for support. The community celebration event was scheduled for the Friday before I left for Chicago, and it turned into something much bigger than anyone had originally planned. What was supposed to be a small ceremony at City Hall expanded into a full evening program at the Riverside Community Center, with local news coverage and attendees from surrounding towns. My parents spent the entire week leading up to it treating me like some kind of celebrity. They bought me another new outfit, scheduled a hair appointment, and even hired a photographer to document the entire evening for our family records. The night of the event, I walked into the community center to find over 200 people in attendance. Mayor Coleman had invited several other mayors from nearby communities, state education officials, representatives from University of Chicago, and what seemed like half the town of Riverside Falls. But the biggest surprise was seeing Mrs. Rodriguez being honored alongside me. Apparently, the state had decided to recognize her as an exceptional educator for her role in identifying and supporting my potential. None of this would have happened without teachers like Mrs. Rodriguez, I said during my speech that evening. She saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself, and she gave me the courage to reach for opportunities I never thought I deserved. The applause was incredible, but what meant the most to me was seeing Mrs. Rodriguez tear up as I spoke.
After 18 years of being told I was an embarrassment, having someone who truly believed in me, being recognized for that belief, felt like the perfect way to close this chapter of my life. As the evening ended and people started heading home, my parents were practically glowing with pride and satisfaction. They'd spent the entire night introducing themselves to local officials, exchanging business cards, and basking in the reflected glory of having raised that campaign girl. But I knew the real test would come the next morning, when I finally left for University of Chicago and had to figure out who I was without all the external validation and attention. Moving to Chicago was like stepping into a completely different world. The University of Chicago campus was massive, intimidating, and filled with students who seemed impossibly confident and sophisticated. For the first time since the campaign launched, I felt like that awkward girl my parents had always said I was. My roommate was a girl named Elena Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, who had perfect makeup, designer clothes, and the kind of effortless social skills I'd never developed. She was friendly enough, but within the first hour of meeting her, I realized we came from completely different universes. "Oh my God, are those your eyes?" she asked when I turned around from unpacking. "They're like super intense. Are you wearing some kind of special contacts?" I explained about the heterochromia, and she thought it was totally cool and very editorial, whatever that meant. But then she started asking about my background, my family, what high school was like, and I found myself struggling to explain my life without mentioning the campaign or the recognition. The truth was, I'd become so used to people knowing my story already that I'd forgotten how to just be a regular person having normal conversations. For months, every interaction had been framed around my academic achievements and my inspiring journey. Now, I was just another freshman trying to figure out where the dining hall was. My first classes were absolutely terrifying. The other students spoke up confidently during discussions, referenced books and concepts I'd never heard of, and seemed to already know each other from summer programs or family connections. I sat in the back of every lecture hall, taking notes frantically and trying to convince myself I belonged there. The worst part was realizing that being the smartest kid in Riverside Falls, Ohio, didn't automatically translate to being competitive at one of the most academically rigorous universities in the country. My first economics assignment came back with a C+ and comments about needing to develop more sophisticated analytical frameworks. I called home that night feeling completely defeated, and my parents' reaction was not at all what I expected. "A C+?" my mom said, her voice going sharp in that familiar way. "Vanessa, you're supposed to be the scholarship girl, the campaign girl. What are people going to think if your grades start slipping?" My dad was even worse. "We've been telling everyone about how brilliant you are, how you're representing our family and our community. You can't just struggle now. Too many people are watching." I realized that my parents hadn't actually changed their fundamental view of me. They'd just shifted from being embarrassed by my differences to being terrified that I might embarrass them by not living up to the image they'd helped create. The pressure was different, but it was still all about how my performance reflected on them. After that phone call, I started spending most of my time in the library, partly to study, but mostly to avoid my roommate and the other students who seemed to be having such an easy time adjusting to college life. I'd find a corner desk on the 4th floor where nobody ever went, and I'd work on assignments until the building closed. It was during one of these late-night library sessions that I met David Kim, a sophomore who was also there every night until closing time. He was a physics major from Portland who wore these thick-rimmed glasses and always had at least 3 different textbooks spread across his table. "You're here every night," he said one evening when we ended up walking out at the same time. "Either you're way more dedicated than the rest of us, or you're avoiding something." I laughed, probably the first genuine laugh I'd had since arriving at school. Maybe a little of both. David became my first real friend at University of Chicago, and the first person I felt comfortable being completely honest with about my situation. He didn't know about the campaign or the billboards or any of the recognition back home. He just knew me as the quiet girl who worked harder than anyone else and sometimes looked overwhelmed by everything. "You know what's weird?" he said one night as we walked back to the dorms. You talk about yourself like you don't deserve to be here, but your insights and discussions are always the most thoughtful ones. You see connections that other people miss. He was right, and as the semester progressed, I started finding my footing academically. My professors began recognizing my work, not because of any external reputation, but because I was putting in the effort and developing genuine expertise in my coursework. But just as I was starting to feel like I might actually belong at university, something happened that reminded me that my past wasn't as far behind as I'd hoped. One of my classmates, a guy named Trevor Walsh from Indianapolis, walked up to me after our political science seminar with his phone in his hand, showing me a screenshot of one of the campaign billboards. "Dude, is this you?" he asked, looking back and forth between me and the image. "My girlfriend saw this while driving through Ohio last month and took a picture because she thought the girl looked familiar. She's been trying to figure out where she'd seen you." Within hours, half my dorm floor knew about the campaign. People started looking up the website, sharing the photos and videos on social media, and suddenly I was the billboard girl instead of just Vanessa who studied too much. Some of the attention was positive. Several students told me my story had inspired them to apply for scholarships or reach out to teachers for support. A few people shared their own experiences with feeling different or facing family pressure about their futures. But there was also a weird undercurrent of skepticism and judgment. I overheard conversations about whether I was actually as smart as the campaign made me seem, or if I was just good at telling a compelling story. Some students seemed to think I'd gotten my scholarship through publicity rather than merit. "It must be nice to have your whole college application basically written for you," one girl said loud enough for me to hear as I walked past her table in the dining hall. "I wish I had some dramatic backstory to make me stand out." The worst part was that their comments echoed some of my own insecurities. Had I earned my place at University of Chicago based on my academic abilities, or had I just been good at fitting the narrative the state education department wanted to promote? I started second-guessing every grade, every comment from professors, every interaction with other students. When I did well on an assignment, I wondered if the professor was being generous because they'd heard about my background. When I struggled with something, I worried it proved that everyone's skepticism was justified. The pressure got even worse when Sarah Chen called to check on how college was going, mentioned that they were planning a follow-up campaign feature about my first semester experience. "We'd love to take some photos on campus, maybe interview a few of your professors about your adjustment to university life," she said. "The story of how you're thriving at such a prestigious school would be really inspiring for other students." But the truth was, I wasn't thriving. I was surviving, barely, and the constant anxiety about living up to everyone's expectations was making everything harder than it needed to be. That night, I called Mrs. Rodriguez for the first time since arriving at school. I explained everything that had been happening, how overwhelmed I felt, and how I was starting to wonder if coming to University of Chicago had been a mistake. "Vanessa," she said, in that calm, steady voice I remembered so well, "do you remember what your grades were like before anyone knew about the campaign? Before the recognition and the photos and all of that?" I thought back to junior and senior year when I was quietly earning A's in advanced classes and helping other students understand complex concepts. Those abilities didn't disappear just because some people are now watching you use them. You belong at that school because of your mind and your work ethic, not because of any publicity. The campaign happened because you were already exceptional, not the other way around. She was right, but it took several more weeks of struggling with self-doubt before I finally started to believe it. The turning point came during a particularly challenging economics exam where I had to synthesize information from multiple sources and develop original arguments about policy implications. I walked out of that exam knowing I'd done well, not because of any external validation or special treatment, but because I genuinely mastered the material and could think critically about complex problems. For the first time since arriving at college, I felt like the smart, capable person I'd been before all the recognition started. But just as I was starting to regain my confidence, my parents called with news that would test everything I'd learned about standing up for myself. "Vanessa, we have incredible news," my mom said, her voice practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. "Channel 8 wants to do a feature story about our family, about how we raised such a successful daughter."
I was sitting in my dorm room working on a philosophy paper when they called, and I immediately felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. My parents had been contacted by Rebecca Martinez, a reporter from Columbus who was doing a series called Families Behind the Success that profiled parents of high-achieving young people. They want to interview all three of us, my dad added, clearly on speakerphone, talk about our parenting philosophy, how we supported your academic development, maybe show some of your childhood photos and awards. The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud. These were the same people who had spent 18 years telling me I was an embarrassment, who had hidden me away during public events, and who had never displayed a single photo of me in our house until after the mayor called. I don't think that's a good idea, I said carefully. I'm really busy with midterms right now, and I'd prefer to keep focusing on my studies. But my parents had already committed to the interview, scheduled for the following weekend when I was supposed to come home for a brief visit. They'd spent the past week cleaning the house, organizing photo albums, and apparently rehearsing talking points about their nurturing approach to raising a gifted child. This is important for our family's reputation, my mom said, using that tone that indicated the decision was already made. People need to understand the kind of support system that created your success. When I arrived home that Friday, I walked into a house I barely recognized. My parents had created an entire shrine to my achievements in the living room, framed photos from the campaign, copies of my scholarship letters, printouts of articles that mentioned me, and even a blown-up version of one of the billboards. But the most disturbing part was what they'd done to my childhood bedroom. They'd redecorated it to look like what they thought a gifted student's room should look like, with color-coordinated bookshelves, academic achievement certificates on the walls, and even a desk setup that looked like something from a magazine. We wanted everything to look cohesive for the cameras, my mom explained, showing me around like I was a house guest instead of someone who'd lived there for 18 years. We need to present the right image of how we've always supported your intellectual development. The interview was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, and Rebecca Martinez arrived with a full camera crew and about 2 hours of questions. She was a pleasant woman in her 40s who clearly believed she was documenting a heartwarming story about supportive parents and family values. "Tell me about Vanessa's early academic indicators," she asked my parents while I sat uncomfortably on our couch. My mom launched into this completely fabricated story about how they'd always recognized my special potential and had made sacrifices to nurture my intellectual growth. She talked about enrichment activities and educational investments that had never happened, describing a childhood that bore no resemblance to my actual experience. "We always encouraged her to embrace what made her unique," my dad added, gesturing toward my eyes. "We taught her that being different was a gift, not something to hide from." I felt like I was watching strangers discuss some other family's life. These were the people who had spent years trying to convince me to wear colored contacts, who had told me I'd never amount to anything, who had treated my academic interests as weird obsessions rather than talents worth developing. "Vanessa, how would you describe your parents' influence on your academic journey?" Rebecca asked, turning the camera toward me. This was my moment of truth. I could expose the entire fiction my parents had created, tell the real story about how I'd succeeded despite their discouragement rather than because of their support, or I could play along with their narrative and protect the image they'd worked so hard to construct. "My parents taught me to be independent and self-reliant," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "They gave me space to develop my own interests and figure out my own path." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. My parents looked relieved that I wasn't contradicting their version of events, and Rebecca seemed satisfied with what she was hearing. The interview continued for another hour, with my parents describing their philosophy of empowerment and their commitment to academic excellence. They showed off the redecorated bedroom, the achievement display, and even pulled out photo albums that they had apparently organized to support their narrative. After the crew left, my parents were practically giddy with excitement about how well everything had gone. "I think we really captured the essence of what makes our family special," my mom said, already planning how to share the segment when it aired. "This is going to show people what real parenting looks like." I spent that evening walking around downtown Riverside Falls, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me was furious that my parents were taking credit for achievements they'd actively discouraged,
But another part of me realized that their need for recognition and validation was probably just as desperate as mine had been when I was younger. The segment aired 2 weeks later, and it was exactly as cringeworthy as I'd expected. The headline was, "The Parents Behind the Billboard Girl: How One Family Nurtured Academic Excellence." And it featured my parents discussing their supportive approach to raising a high-achieving daughter. David watched it with me in the dorm common room, and his reaction was immediately suspicious. "Something about this doesn't add up," he said, after my mom finished explaining her philosophy of celebrating differences. "You've never once mentioned your parents being supportive of your academics. Usually you talk about them like they were obstacles you had to overcome." I ended up telling him the whole real story: the years of discouragement, the attempts to hide me during public events, the sudden transformation after the mayor called. David listened without interrupting, but I could see his expression getting more and more incredulous. "So they're basically taking credit for your success after spending 18 years trying to prevent it?" he said when I finished. "That's actually kind of impressive in how awful it is." The worst part was that the TV segment worked exactly like my parents had hoped. They started getting friend requests from people they barely knew, invitations to speak at parenting workshops, and even inquiries about writing a book about raising successful children. My mom quit her real estate job to focus on what she called sharing our family story, and my dad started presenting himself as an expert on nurturing gifted children, despite having no background in education or child development. They created social media accounts dedicated to their parenting journey, where they posted daily insights about raising academically successful kids. They even started a blog called The Excellence Approach, where they gave advice to other parents about supporting their children's educational goals. The comments on their posts were mostly positive, with other parents asking for specific tips and praising their dedication to my development. But occasionally, someone would ask questions that got a little too close to the truth. "Your daughter seems very self-directed," one person commented on a blog post about fostering independence. "How did you balance giving her space with providing guidance during difficult periods?" My mom's response was a masterpiece of creative fiction. "We've always believed in being quietly supportive rather than micromanaging. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a gifted child is trust their instincts and be available when they need you." Meanwhile, I was dealing with the fallout of being known as someone whose parents were now minor celebrities in the parenting excellence community. Several of my professors had seen the TV segment, and a few classmates made comments about how lucky I was to have such a supportive family. The attention reached its peak when my parents were invited to speak at a regional education conference about family strategies for academic success. They accepted immediately and asked if I could come home that weekend to join them on the panel. "Absolutely not," I told them during our phone call. "I will not participate in presenting a completely false narrative about my childhood." For the first time since the campaign started, I was putting my foot down. But I had no idea how my parents would react to me refusing to play along with their new public image. My parents did not take my refusal well. "What do you mean you won't participate?" my mom said, her voice climbing to that pitch that meant she was about to lose it completely. "Vanessa, this is a huge opportunity for our family. We're talking about a regional education conference with hundreds of attendees. And potentially book deals," my dad added. "Publishers have already reached out after seeing the TV segment. This could be life-changing for us." The irony wasn't lost on me that they were talking about book deals based on a parenting approach that had never actually existed. But what really bothered me was the phrase life-changing for us. Not for me, not for other families who might benefit from genuine advice, but for them and their newfound status as parenting experts. "I'm not going to stand on a stage and lie about my childhood," I said firmly. "Find another way to make your money." That comment triggered the biggest fight we'd had since I'd left for college. My mom accused me of being ungrateful and selfish, while my dad went on a rant about how much they'd sacrificed to support my education. They brought up the shopping trip for my first photo session, the business cards they'd printed, even the cost of redecorating my bedroom for the TV interview.
"We've invested everything in your success," my mom said, crying now, "and you're just going to abandon us when we finally have a chance to benefit from all that investment?" The word investment hit me like a punch to the stomach. That's what I was to them. Not a daughter they loved and supported, but an investment that was supposed to pay dividends in the form of social status and financial opportunities. I hung up on them and didn't answer when they called back 6 times over the next hour. The next few weeks were tense. My parents left increasingly desperate voicemails about the conference approaching and how they needed me there to make their presentation authentic. They offered to pay me for appearing, promised I wouldn't have to say much, even suggested I could just sit in the audience and be introduced as their successful daughter. But I held firm, and they ended up doing the conference presentation without me. According to the blog post my mom wrote afterward, they explained my absence by saying I was too focused on midterms to travel and that they respected my dedication to academic priorities. The presentation apparently went well enough that they were invited to 3 more conferences over the next month. My mom's blog following grew to over 15,000 subscribers, and my dad started getting paid speaking engagements at local school districts. Meanwhile, I was trying to focus on my studies and the normal aspects of college life that had nothing to do with campaigns or publicity. David and I had started studying together regularly, and I'd even made friends with a few other students in my political science program who knew nothing about my background. One evening in November, while I was in the library working on a research paper about educational policy, I got a call from Mrs. Rodriguez. She was the one person from home I still trusted completely, so I always answered when she called. "Vanessa, I need to ask you about something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," she said, her voice sounding more serious than usual. Apparently, she'd been contacted by a journalist named Michael Chen from the Columbus Dispatch, who was working on a follow-up story about the state's education campaign. He'd been interviewing various people involved in the program, including some of my former teachers, and had started noticing inconsistencies in the different versions of my story that were circulating. "He asked me about your parents' role in supporting your academic development," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully, "and I found myself in an awkward position because what I observed doesn't match what they've been saying publicly." She went on to explain that Michael had done some research into my parents' new speaking career and blog and had found several statements that didn't align with what other teachers remembered about my family situation. "I told him I'd need to speak with you before sharing any information," she said, "but Vanessa, I think you should know that someone is looking into this story more deeply." My first instinct was panic. If a real journalist started investigating my family's claims, the entire fiction my parents had constructed would fall apart publicly. They'd be exposed as liars, their speaking career would end, and all the recognition they'd gained would turn into humiliation. But then I realized something important. I wasn't responsible for protecting their lies. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "but if he contacts you directly, I think you should consider telling the truth. Not just for your own integrity, but because there are parents out there following your family's advice who deserve to know whether it's based on real experience." She was right. My parents were now giving workshops to hundreds of other families, charging money to share strategies they'd never actually used, and potentially misleading parents who genuinely wanted to support their children's academic success. Michael Chen called me 2 days later. He was professional and respectful, but also clearly thorough in his research. He'd spoken to several of my high school teachers, looked into my academic records, and even tracked down some of my former classmates. "I'm working on a piece about the authenticity of success stories in public education campaigns," he explained, "and I found some discrepancies between different accounts of your family background that I'd like to clarify." He didn't accuse anyone of lying outright, but he asked pointed questions about my parents' level of involvement in my academic development, their attitudes towards my heterochromia, and whether their current public statements matched my actual childhood experience. I found myself at another crossroads moment, similar to the TV interview, but with much higher stakes. I could continue protecting my parents' fabricated narrative, or I could tell the truth and potentially destroy the public image they'd worked so hard to build. "Can I ask you something?" I said to Michael. "If you publish this story, what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish?"
Accountability, he said without hesitation. If people are making money by giving advice based on false claims, the public deserves to know. And if the state's education campaign is being used to promote misleading family success stories, that's a misuse of taxpayer resources. He made a good point. The original campaign was supposed to encourage students by showing them genuine examples of overcoming obstacles and achieving academic success. If my family story was being distorted to serve my parents' financial interests, it undermined the entire purpose of the program. I'll answer your questions, I told him, but I want to review anything you write before it's published. That's not usually how journalism works, Michael said, but given the sensitive nature of this story and your age, I can let you see the sections that directly quote you. We scheduled a phone interview for the following evening, and I spent the entire day thinking about what I was going to say. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own narrative, instead of just reacting to other people's versions of my story. But I also knew that once I told the truth to a journalist, there would be no going back. My parents would know exactly who had exposed their lies, and I'd have to live with the consequences of destroying their newfound success and reputation. The night before the interview, David found me in the library looking stressed and distracted. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, sitting down across from my usual table. I explained the whole situation, the journalist's investigation, my parents' speaking career built on lies, and my decision to finally tell the truth about my childhood. "You know what's interesting?" David said after I finished. "You're more worried about hurting your parents by telling the truth than they ever were about hurting you by denying it." He was absolutely right, and that realization made my decision much easier. The phone interview with Michael Chen lasted almost 3 hours. I told him everything: the years of discouragement, the attempts to hide my eyes, the complete lack of support for my academic interests, and the sudden transformation after Mayor Coleman's call. I described finding my redecorated bedroom, watching my parents fabricate stories for the TV cameras, and listening to them give parenting advice they'd never actually practiced. Michael was a skilled interviewer who asked follow-up questions that helped me articulate details I hadn't even fully processed myself. By the end of our conversation, I felt exhausted but also strangely relieved. For the first time in my life, I'd told the complete, unvarnished truth about my family situation to someone who had the power to do something about it. "I want you to know this wasn't an easy decision," Michael said as we wrapped up. "I understand you're essentially exposing your own parents' deception. That takes courage." The article was published 3 weeks later, with the headline, "The Truth Behind the Billboard: How One Family's Success Story Became a Marketing Fiction." Michael had done thorough investigative work, corroborating my account with interviews from Mrs. Rodriguez, several of my former teachers, and even some of my high school classmates who remembered my parents' actual behavior during school events. The piece didn't just focus on my family. It examined the broader issue of how education campaigns sometimes amplified misleading narratives without proper fact-checking. It questioned whether the state had done due diligence in verifying the family stories they were promoting and spending taxpayer money to publicize. The response was immediate and intense. Within hours of the article going live online, my parents' blog was flooded with angry comments from people who felt deceived. Their upcoming speaking engagements were canceled, and several school districts requested refunds for workshops they'd already paid for. My mom called me that evening, and she was more furious than I'd ever heard her. "How could you do this to us?" she screamed into the phone. "We're being destroyed on social media. People are calling us frauds and liars. Our entire reputation is ruined." "Your reputation was built on lies," I said calmly. "I just told the truth about what actually happened." "The truth?" My dad joined the call. "The truth is that we raised a daughter who succeeded academically and received a full scholarship to University of Chicago. The details don't matter." But the details did matter, especially to the hundreds of parents who had paid money to attend their workshops or who had been following their blog for genuine parenting advice. The comment section of the Columbus Dispatch article was filled with people sharing their own stories about feeling misled and manipulated. One comment particularly stood out to me. "I spent $200 on their workshop and have been trying to implement their quietly supportive approach with my shy daughter. Now I find out they were actually discouraging their own child for years. I feel like an idiot for believing them. That comment made me realize that my decision to speak up had been about more than just my own relationship with my parents. It was about preventing other families from being harmed by advice based on fabricated experiences. The state education department launched their own internal review of the campaign, and Sarah Chen called to apologize for not doing more thorough background checks on the families they'd featured. The billboard campaign was quietly discontinued, though she assured me that my scholarship and recognition were completely legitimate and unaffected by the controversy. "Your academic achievements speak for themselves," she said. "This situation with your parents doesn't change the fact that you earned your place at University of Chicago through your own merit and hard work." Mrs. Rodriguez called a few days after the article was published to check on how I was handling everything. "I'm proud of you for telling the truth," she said. "I know that wasn't easy, especially knowing the consequences for your parents." "I keep going back and forth between feeling guilty and feeling angry," I admitted. "Part of me thinks I destroyed my family for the sake of strangers on the internet." "Vanessa, you didn't destroy your family," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "Your parents built their recent success on a foundation of lies, and that was always going to collapse eventually. You just controlled when and how it happened instead of waiting for someone else to expose it." She was right. Michael Chen had already been investigating inconsistencies in my family's story when he contacted me. If I hadn't cooperated with his research, he would have published the article anyway, but without my perspective to provide context and nuance. The most unexpected outcome of the whole situation was how it affected my relationship with my parents. Instead of the complete estrangement I'd feared, we entered into a period of brutal honesty that was actually more genuine than any conversations we'd had in years. During a phone call in December, my mom finally acknowledged what I'd known my entire life. "We were embarrassed by your eyes," she said, her voice small and tired. "We thought people would judge us for having a child who looked different, and we handled it terribly. When you started getting recognition, we saw a chance to rewrite our mistakes and present ourselves as the parents we wished we'd been." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the first time either of my parents had admitted their actual motivations instead of hiding behind justifications and excuses. My dad was more direct. "We screwed up your childhood because we were shallow and insecure. Then we tried to profit from pretending we hadn't screwed up. You were right to expose us." These conversations didn't magically repair 18 years of damage, but they created a foundation for something more honest than we'd ever had before. My parents started attending family therapy sessions over Zoom and slowly began the process of understanding how their behavior had affected me. The spring semester brought new opportunities that had nothing to do with campaigns or publicity. I was selected for a competitive research program in political economics, started tutoring other students through the university's academic support center, and even joined the debate team after David convinced me I had valuable perspectives to contribute. For the first time in my life, I was being recognized for my actual abilities and contributions rather than for my inspiring backstory or my unusual appearance. My professors knew my work, my classmates respected my insights, and my friends valued my personality, not my narrative. The final piece of the puzzle came in April, when I received an unexpected email from a high school student in Michigan named Ashley Thompson. She'd read the Columbus Dispatch article and wanted to thank me for speaking up. "I have a birthmark that covers half my face," she wrote, "and my parents have been pressuring me to get surgery to fix it before I start applying to colleges. They keep saying it will hurt my chances and that I need to think about how it reflects on our family. Reading your story helped me realize that my parents' embarrassment is their problem, not mine. I'm keeping my birthmark and applying for academic scholarships based on my grades, not my appearance." That email made everything worth it. All the family drama, the destroyed relationships, the public controversy, it was all justified by the possibility that my story might help other young people avoid the years of self-doubt and family pressure I'd experienced. 6 months later, my parents had quietly returned to their original jobs and stopped giving parenting advice to strangers on the internet. We video called every few weeks, and while our relationship would never be perfect, it was finally based on truth instead of fiction. I'm finishing my freshman year at University of Chicago with a 3.8 GPA, genuine friendships, and a clear sense of who I am beyond any external recognition or family expectations. Sometimes people still recognize me from the old campaign materials, but now, when they ask about my story, I tell them the real one, not the inspirational version designed for billboards, but the complicated, imperfect truth about learning to value yourself even when the people who are supposed to love you can't see your worth. The ripple effects of speaking up continued well beyond that first semester. By sophomore year, I'd been contacted by 3 different organizations that support students from challenging family situations. One group, called Authentic Achievement, asked if I'd be willing to share my real story at their annual conference. Not the sanitized campaign version, but the messy, complicated truth about succeeding despite family obstacles rather than because of family support. Speaking at that conference was terrifying but transformative. The audience was filled with educators, counselors, and students who understood that family dynamics aren't always supportive, and that sometimes the most impressive achievements come from young people who've had to believe in themselves when no one else would. The narrative that all successful students come from nurturing, supportive families is not only false, but it's harmful, I told the audience of about 300 people. It makes students from difficult situations feel like they're starting from a deficit, when in reality, they've often developed resilience and self-reliance that are tremendous strengths. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Maria Santos, a researcher from Northwestern University who was studying the correlation between family support and academic achievement. She'd been following my story since the original campaign and was particularly interested in my perspective on how educational success narratives are constructed and marketed. "Would you consider collaborating on a research project?" she asked. "We're examining how public education campaigns sometimes oversimplify complex family dynamics, and your case study would be invaluable." Working with Dr. Santos became one of the most intellectually engaging experiences of my college career. We spent months analyzing not just my story, but dozens of other education campaign features, looking for patterns in how families were portrayed versus the reality of students' actual experiences. Our research revealed that nearly 60% of featured success stories involved some level of narrative editing that made family situations appear more supportive than they actually were. The reasons were usually well-intentioned. Campaign organizers wanted inspiring stories that would motivate other students. But the effect was to create unrealistic expectations and false models of what supportive parenting looked like. "The problem isn't that these campaigns want to inspire students," Dr. Santos explained during one of our research meetings. "The problem is that they've decided inspiration requires perfect family stories, when the truth is that many students find genuine inspiration in knowing they're not alone in facing family challenges." Our paper was published in the Journal of Educational Policy the following spring, and it sparked conversations about authenticity and public education messaging that extended far beyond my personal situation. Several states revised their campaign guidelines to include more diverse family narratives, and at least one organization created a program specifically designed to support students whose families were unsupportive of their academic goals. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents continued evolving in unexpected directions. The family therapy sessions had helped them understand not just how their behavior had affected me, but why they'd been so threatened by my differences in the first place. During one particularly revealing session, my mom talked about her own childhood with parents who valued conformity above almost everything else. "I was terrified that if people saw Vanessa as different or unusual, they'd judge me the same way my mother used to judge other families," she admitted. "I realize now that I was protecting myself instead of protecting her." My dad's insights were equally illuminating. He'd grown up in a family where achievement was everything, but only certain kinds of achievement counted. Academic success was fine for boys, but girls were supposed to be pretty and social first, he said. When Vanessa was clearly more interested in books than social activities, and when she looked different from other kids, I didn't know how to value what she was good at. These revelations didn't excuse their behavior, but they helped me understand it in a way that made forgiveness possible. More importantly, they started changing how they interacted with me in the present. Instead of trying to manage my image or take credit for my achievements, they began asking genuine questions about my studies, my friendships, and my plans for the future. The transformation became especially clear during my junior year, when I was selected for a prestigious study abroad program in Oxford, England. Instead of immediately posting about it on social media or looking for ways to publicize the achievement, my parents' first reactions were concern for my well-being and excitement about the learning opportunities. "Are you sure you'll be comfortable living in a different country for a whole semester?" my mom asked during our weekly call. "I know you've gotten more confident over the past few years, but that's still a big adjustment." It was the first time I could remember her expressing concern about my emotional experience rather than worrying about how my choices might reflect on the family. My time at Oxford was incredible in ways I never could have predicted. Studying political philosophy at one of the world's most prestigious universities was academically challenging and intellectually stimulating, but the real growth happened in my confidence and self-advocacy skills. Living in a new country, navigating unfamiliar social customs, and holding my own seminars with brilliant students from around the world taught me that I could adapt to almost any situation. More importantly, it confirmed that my academic abilities were genuinely strong, not just impressive relative to my small-town background.
I also met other students who had complicated relationships with recognition and family expectations. My roommate, Elena Petrov from Bulgaria, had won a national science competition at 16, only to have her parents use her achievement to advance their own careers in academia. Her story helped me realize that family members exploiting children's success was more common than I'd thought. The hardest part wasn't winning the competition, Elena told me during one of our late-night conversations. It was watching my parents give interviews about their scientific parenting methods when they'd never shown any interest in my experiments until I started winning awards. These conversations with fellow students helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique and that speaking up about family dysfunction around achievement could help other young people feel less alone in their situations. When I returned to Chicago for my senior year, I was approached by a literary agent who'd read my research paper and wondered if I'd be interested in writing a book about authentic achievement and family dynamics. The idea was both exciting and terrifying, sharing my story in even more detail, but this time with complete control over the narrative. I spent months working on a book proposal that balanced personal memoir with broader analysis of how families and society pressure young people to succeed in specific ways. The book, tentatively titled Beyond the Billboard: Real Stories of Academic Success, would feature not just my story, but interviews with dozens of other students who had complex relationships with recognition and family support. The proposal was picked up by a respected publisher, and suddenly I found myself with a book contract and a deadline. Writing the full story, including details I'd never shared publicly, was emotionally exhausting but ultimately liberating. For the first time, I was able to present my complete experience without worrying about protecting anyone else's feelings or reputation. The book's publication during my senior year generated significant media attention, but this time I was in control of how my story was told. The interviews I gave focused on the broader themes of authenticity, resilience, and the complexity of family relationships rather than on sensational details about my parents' deception. One of the most meaningful responses came from a high school guidance counselor in Texas who wrote to thank me for including resources and strategies for students from unsupportive families. "I've been working with teenagers for 20 years," she wrote, "and your book is the first resource I've found that acknowledges what these kids are actually dealing with instead of pretending all families are supportive of academic achievement." By graduation, I had been accepted to several PhD programs in political science, with full funding and research opportunities that excited me more than any recognition I'd ever received. My parents attended the ceremony, and for the first time in my life, their pride seemed genuine rather than performative. "We're proud of who you've become," my mom said after the ceremony, "not because of what you've achieved, but because of how you've handled everything, including us."
My dad was characteristically more direct. You turned out to be a better person than we deserved, and definitely better than we raised you to be. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was an honest one. We'd all learned that authentic relationships require acknowledging mistakes and growing from them, rather than pretending problems never existed. As I prepare to start my doctoral studies this fall, I often think about how different my life might have been if Mayor Coleman had never made that phone call. Would I have found the confidence to pursue University of Chicago without external validation? Would my parents ever have recognized my worth without public pressure to do so? The truth is, I'll never know. But I do know that the most important lesson from this entire experience wasn't about overcoming family obstacles or achieving academic success despite the odds. It was about learning to value authenticity over approval, truth over convenience, and genuine growth over manufactured inspiration. And that, honestly, is a much better story than any campaign could ever create. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.